The poor rancher saved two giant Apache twins. That night, they whispered they wanted him together. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In the vast, rugged wilderness of the American West, a poor rancher named Thomas McCall lived a life of solitude. He had inherited his small, modest ranch from his father, but with no family of his own, his days were filled with hard work and isolation. His ranch was just a speck in the vast expanse of rolling hills and endless prairie. With no close neighbors, Thomas had grown accustomed to the silence, the only company being his horses and cattle. It was a simple, quiet life, but it was the only one he knew. On a cold evening in early autumn, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the open plains, Thomas was working in the barn when he noticed something strange. Two figures, barely visible against the dimming light, were approaching his ranch. They moved with surprising grace, despite their size, and Thomas, a man of few words, couldn't help but stare. As they came closer, he saw that they were two women, both towering in height and dressed in traditional Apache clothing. Their presence was striking, and their size, especially, caught him off guard. The woman on the left appeared even larger than the other, with broad shoulders and a commanding posture. The other was slightly smaller, but still far larger than any woman Thomas had ever encountered. They looked as if they had stepped straight out of a legend, their movements fluid and confident. Despite the initial shock, Thomas approached them, wary but curious. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to understand that not all encounters were dangerous. The two women stopped in front of him, their eyes locked on his with an intensity that seemed to weigh him down. The larger of the two spoke first, her voice deep but calm. "We need your help," she said simply. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Helping strangers wasn't something he had done often, but something about these women made him hesitate. "What do you need?" he asked cautiously, his hand still resting on the wooden fence post. The smaller woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with a strange, unreadable expression. "We have been traveling for days," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We are lost and in need of shelter. Please, will you help us?" Without fully understanding why, Thomas found himself nodding. He opened the barn door wider, motioning for them to come inside. As they stepped closer, he noticed the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness of a long journey, and the faint scent of smoke and earth that clung to their clothes. They had been through something that had brought them here, to his quiet, humble ranch. Inside, he offered them a seat by the fire, and without asking further questions, he set about preparing food for them. As he worked, he could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their gaze like a silent promise. It wasn't long before the women ate, silently, their eyes never leaving Thomas. Once they had finished, the silence in the room grew heavier. The larger woman stood, her figure towering over Thomas as she approached him. "You helped us," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Now we will help you in ways you cannot yet understand." The words lingered in the air, leaving Thomas with a strange sense of unease. He had no idea what they meant, but he knew, deep down, that something had shifted. As the night grew darker, the women prepared to leave. But just before they stepped out the door, the smaller woman turned to Thomas and whispered, "We will return, and when we do, you will have to make a choice. A choice that will change everything." And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving Thomas standing alone in the quiet barn, wondering just what kind of choice he would be forced to make in the days to come. It had been a few days since the two Apache women left, and Thomas McCall could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The night they had left, with the mysterious words of the larger woman lingering in the air, had left him restless. He went about his days in the same routine as before, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and tending to the barn, but something was different now. His quiet life, the one he had carefully built and grown accustomed to, now felt hollow. He had helped them, without hesitation, and they had promised to return. But what did that promise mean? What choice would he have to make? And why had they come to him, of all people? These questions played over and over in his mind as the days passed. He tried to keep himself busy, but there was always the gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, the sensation that his life was about to change in ways he could not predict. Then, one morning, as the sun was beginning to rise, he heard it, the sound of hooves in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as the noise grew louder, he knew something was approaching. He stepped out of the barn, shielding his eyes from the early morning light, and looked toward the horizon. There they were, the two Apache women, now accompanied by a group of warriors. His heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting their return, but not like this. Not with an entire group of men. They rode in a loose formation, their faces painted with the symbols of their tribe, and their eyes fixed on him as they neared the ranch. The leader of the group, the larger woman, rode ahead of the others, her posture commanding, her presence undeniable. As they reached him, she dismounted and approached him, the warriors behind her following her lead. Thomas's pulse quickened. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The woman looked at him, her gaze steady and serious. "You helped us," she said, her voice low. "Now, it is time for you to make the choice." Thomas swallowed hard. He had thought about this moment, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. He had no idea what kind of choice he would be faced with, but he knew that whatever it was, it would change his life forever. "What choice?" he asked, his voice steady despite the racing thoughts in his head. The woman's eyes softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "You will either come with us and join our people, or you will stay here and live the rest of your life in solitude. The choice is yours." Thomas blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of her words. He had expected something more complicated, more drawn out, but it was clear that this was the decision that had been weighing on him all along. He glanced back at the quiet ranch, the land that had been his home for so many years. This place, this lonely, peaceful existence, had been all he knew. But now, standing before these powerful Apache warriors, he realized that it was no longer enough. He had been given a chance at something greater, something more meaningful. But was he ready to take it? The larger woman watched him closely, as if she could read his thoughts. "You have helped us," she said again, "and now we offer you the chance to stand with us, to be a part of something bigger than yourself. We will protect you, and you will help us protect our land, our people." Thomas could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. His mind raced as he tried to imagine what his life would look like if he chose to leave this place behind and join their tribe. He had spent so many years alone, but now here, in this moment, he realized that being alone no longer seemed like the best option. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, he spoke. "I'll go with you," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. The woman nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Then come. We have much to do, and your journey with us begins now." With that, the warriors began to gather around him, leading him toward their horses. As he climbed onto the horse beside the larger woman, he felt a surge of anticipation, mixed with fear. What awaited him with the Apache tribe? What kind of life would he have now that he had made this choice? As they rode away from his ranch, leaving behind the life he had known, Thomas knew one thing for sure. His world was about to change, and he was no longer in control of the story. But for the first time in years, he felt alive, as if he had finally stepped out of the shadows of his solitude and into something far more powerful. The days that followed Thomas McCall's decision to join the Apache tribe felt like a whirlwind. He had spent his life working the land, understanding the rhythms of nature, and finding solace in the solitude of his ranch. But now, he was part of something far greater, something he had never imagined. The two Apache women, whose names he had yet to fully understand, led him into the heart of their camp, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and smoke. The warriors had been silent on the ride, but their presence was overwhelming. As they reached the camp, a sense of reverence filled the air, and Thomas realized that the stories he had heard about the Apache were only the beginning. They were more than just a tribe. They were a force of nature. The leader of the group, the larger woman, finally spoke to him again as they dismounted. "This is your new home," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You will learn our ways, just as we will learn yours." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had no idea what to expect, but he was here now. The camp was unlike anything he had ever seen. There were tents made from animal skins, fires burning in the center of the gathering area, and people moving with a purpose. Children ran around, laughing, while older warriors practiced their skills with weapons. It was a place that was alive, vibrant with energy, and Thomas felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. As the days passed, Thomas was introduced to the ways of the Apache. He learned how to track animals, how to read the land for signs that most people would miss, and how to survive in a harsh world that seemed intent on swallowing up the weak. The warriors taught him to fight, not with brute force, but with precision and strategy. He was also shown the sacred rituals of the tribe, the dances, the songs, and the stories that connected them to the land and their ancestors. The connection between the Apache and the land was something that struck Thomas deeply. It was not just a physical connection, but a spiritual one. He had always respected the land, but the Apache taught him that the land was alive, and they were its stewards. It was a responsibility that Thomas had never fully understood until now. But even as he adapted to his new life, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his presence here. The larger woman, whom he had learned was called Nehemina, had been kind to him, but there was always a distance in her eyes. She had not spoken much about herself or her people, and Thomas had learned not to press her. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the firelight cast long shadows across the camp, Nehemina called him over. "You have proven yourself to be strong, Thomas McCall," she said, her voice soft. "But you must understand something." He looked at her, curiosity rising. "What is it?" he asked. She met his gaze, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite read. "You are not just here to learn. You are here because you are part of a larger plan. The choice you made to come with us has consequences." Thomas frowned, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Nehemina took a deep breath, her shoulders stiffening. "There are enemies of our people who will stop at nothing to destroy us. They will come for us, and they will come for you. Your decision to join us will make you a target." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that his choice would change his life, but he had not considered the danger that would come with it. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Nehemina looked at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since they had met, she smiled. It was a small, fleeting smile, but it was enough to make Thomas feel like he had passed some unspoken test. "We will need your strength," she said, "and your courage." The days that followed were filled with preparations. The warriors trained harder, sharpening their skills, and the women of the tribe gathered the supplies they would need. Thomas, for his part, threw himself into the work. He knew that the stakes had been raised. He was no longer just a rancher. He was now part of a tribe, and their survival depended on him as much as it did on anyone else. As the first battle approached, Thomas found himself standing beside Nehemina, watching the horizon for signs of the approaching threat. He had joined the Apache to learn, to find something greater than himself. But now, he realized that he had become something else entirely, a protector, a warrior, and a man who had chosen a side. The winds were shifting, and Thomas could feel the weight of the coming storm. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when the Apache warriors began their silent march. Thomas McCall stood at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The air was thick with tension, and the night, usually a time for rest, had transformed into a moment of uncertain anticipation. He had learned much in the time he had spent with the Apache tribe, but this was different. This was not just about survival. It was about defending everything they held dear. Nehemina, the towering woman who had once been a stranger, now stood beside him. Her presence, as commanding as ever, seemed to grow even more powerful as the night grew darker. She had become a mentor, a leader, and, though he would not admit it aloud, someone Thomas respected more than he could have imagined. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low, but steady. Thomas nodded, his hand gripping the hilt of the sword he had learned to wield in the past few days. His body was no longer just that of a rancher. He had transformed, in body and spirit, into something more. "I am," he said. The air was filled with the sounds of the warriors preparing for battle, horses neighing, weapons being sharpened, the quiet murmurs of leaders giving instructions. The Apache were ready, but what they were about to face, no one knew for certain. Nehemina had not shared many details, But there were whispers in the camp of a band of mercenaries who had been hunting them for weeks. These mercenaries were not just any group. They were skilled, ruthless, and determined to bring down the Apache tribe. Nehemina's father, the tribal chief, had been gathering support from other tribes, but the danger was immediate. "We will fight, but we will not fight in anger," Nehemina said, her eyes searching the horizon as if she could already see the coming storm. "We fight because it is our right to protect what is ours. Our land, our people, our lives." Thomas nodded again, feeling the weight of her words. As a rancher, he had always been connected to the land. He had tended to it, worked it, and lived off its fruits. But now, it felt like the land was part of him in a way he had never experienced before. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something greater, something sacred. As the warriors mounted their horses and readied their weapons, Nehemina turned to Thomas. "You stand with us now. You are one of us." The words, simple as they were, held a depth that Thomas had never truly understood until now. He wasn't just an outsider who had stumbled into their lives. He was part of their fight, their future, and their struggle. They rode out into the dark night, the moonlight casting long shadows across the desert as they made their way to the valley where the mercenaries were expected. The journey was tense, each warrior moving in silence, their eyes sharp and focused. They knew the stakes. This was a battle for their very existence. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the valley came into view. The air was still, eerily quiet, and the only sounds were the faint echoes of horses and the shifting of the Apache warriors. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the site, the landscape seeming to stretch endlessly in front of them. And then he saw them. The mercenaries, scattered across the valley, preparing for something. They were unaware of the Apache's arrival. "We strike quickly," Nehemina said, her voice commanding. "We strike with precision. We show them what it means to mess with the Apache." As the warriors prepared to launch their attack, Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline. He had no illusions about the violence they were about to unleash, but there was something else inside him, something fierce and determined. This was the moment. This was the test of everything he had learned, everything he had become since joining the Apache. As they charged forward, the clash of steel and the sounds of war filled the air. It was chaotic, violent, and brutal, but Thomas fought with a focus he had never known. The fight seemed to stretch on forever, the battle raging with no clear end in sight. But slowly, the tide began to turn. The mercenaries, once confident in their numbers and strength, began to falter. The Apache were relentless, their precision and strength overwhelming. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the battle ended. The mercenaries had been defeated. As Thomas stood, panting from the exertion, he looked around at the scene of the battle. The ground was littered with the fallen, but the Apache were victorious. Nehemina rode up beside him, her eyes scanning the field with a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. "We have won," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But remember, victory is never the end. It is only the beginning." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. This was just one battle in a much larger war. And now, he was truly a part of it. The Apache had won this time, but the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But as he looked around at the warriors, the women, and the children who had gathered around him, he realized that he was no longer the lonely rancher he once was. He was a part of something greater, and that was a future worth fighting for. The aftermath of the battle left Thomas McCall with a strange sense of emptiness. They had won, yes, but the cost was high. The Apache warriors, despite their victory, moved quietly through the aftermath, their faces stoic, their spirits not entirely at peace. Thomas had witnessed the toll war took on both sides, and while the mercenaries were defeated, the Apache's victory had a weight to it. Nehemina, the towering leader who had guided him through the battle, had taken a moment to herself by the fire, sitting with her legs crossed, staring into the flickering flames. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of both satisfaction and sorrow. Thomas approached cautiously, unsure of what to say or do. He had come to respect her deeply, but this moment felt different. The fierce warrior, the woman who had shown him how to fight, now seemed distant, lost in her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, his voice soft, hesitant. Nehemina glanced up at him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "Victory is a double-edged sword," she replied, her voice low and steady. "We fight to protect, but we also destroy. We take life to preserve it. It is a burden." Thomas nodded, understanding more than he had before. The battle had been brutal, and though they had been victorious, the Apache had lost warriors as well. "I never thought it would be like this," Thomas said, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought the fight was just about survival, but it's more than that, isn't it?" Nehemina's gaze shifted toward him, her eyes piercing. "It is always more than survival. It is about honor. It is about legacy. And it is about the land we protect." She paused, looking around at the vast expanse of land that stretched out before them. "This land, Thomas, is more than just dirt and rock. It is a part of us. We fight for it because it is the blood that flows through our veins. Without it, we cease to exist." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas had never thought of the land this way. He had always seen it as something to work, something to survive on. But Nehemina was teaching him that it was something deeper, something sacred. The warriors were beginning to gather their fallen comrades, preparing them for the journey back to their village. The air was thick with the weight of the loss, but also with the resolve that came from surviving. The fight was over, but the war, as Nehemina had warned him, was far from done. As the days passed, Thomas found himself immersed in the tribe's way of life, learning their customs and rituals more deeply. He helped with the wounded, learned to prepare food in ways he had never imagined, and sat by the fire listening to stories passed down through generations. But there was something else, something that had been growing between him and Nehemina. As the leader of the warriors, Nehemina was a figure of strength and authority, but she had also shown him another side. In quiet moments, when the camp was still, she would speak to him about her people, about the struggles they had faced, about the losses they had endured. And through it all, Thomas saw a different side to her, a vulnerability he hadn't expected. He found himself drawn to her, not just because of her strength, but because of the depth of her soul, the way she carried the weight of her people's history with such grace. One night, after the last of the warriors had fallen into a deep sleep, Thomas found himself sitting beside Nehemina by the fire. The stars above them were like a blanket of light, and the desert air was cool against his skin. "You are different from the man I met when I first came here," Nehemina said, breaking the silence. "You have become one of us, Thomas, not just in body, but in spirit." Thomas looked into her eyes, searching for the right words. "I never expected this life. I thought I was just helping you out of kindness, but now I know this is my fight too. My fight for the land. My fight for your people." Nehemina's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. "And you will fight, Thomas. But you must also choose." Thomas felt his heart race. "Choose what?" "Choose what side you are on truly. This fight, this war, will not end easily. There will be more battles, more bloodshed. You must decide whether you are with us fully. To be Apache is to be bound by more than blood. It is a bond of heart, of soul." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had already made his decision, hadn't he? But now, as he looked into her eyes, he realized there was more to this than just joining the fight. It was a commitment to a way of life, a commitment to a people who had suffered, but who also knew the value of loyalty, honor, and a deep connection to the land. "I am with you," Thomas said, his voice strong, unwavering. "Not just because I fight alongside you, but because I believe in what you are fighting for." Nehemina nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. "Then we will face whatever comes next, together." The night grew quieter, and the fire flickered as the two of them sat in silence, knowing that the journey ahead would not be easy, but that they were no longer just strangers thrown together by fate. They were allies, bound by a shared purpose, and whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The days after their decision to stand together were filled with an unsettling quiet. The Apache warriors, having secured a hard-won victory, were now preparing for the next stage of their journey. But Thomas McCall felt the weight of something far heavier. He had made his commitment to the Apache people, and now, it seemed, the true test was just beginning. Nehemina had kept her promise to teach him the ways of the tribe, but as time passed, Thomas knew that he was no longer just a learner. He was becoming a protector, a guardian of not just the land, but of their very way of life. The landscape of the West had always been harsh, but the Apache were in a constant battle to preserve it against forces that wanted to take it away from them. It was a battle of survival, and it was one that required more than just skill with a weapon. As the sun set one evening, casting the desert sky in brilliant shades of purple and red, Thomas found himself walking through the camp, his mind racing. It was hard to quiet the thoughts in his head, thoughts of the future, of the war that was coming, of the family he had left behind. Though he was now part of the Apache, the memories of his former life lingered, especially as he watched the families and warriors preparing for the next raid. It was then that Nehemina appeared beside him, her silhouette outlined against the setting sun. "You seem troubled," she said, her voice soft but sharp. He looked at her, his eyes betraying the unease he had been feeling. "I can't help but think of what's coming. We've won battles, but we're only a small part of this fight. There are so many more out there, and it seems like we're constantly running out of time." Nehemina was silent for a moment, her eyes distant as if searching for the right words. When she spoke, it was with a calm that Thomas had come to admire. "This fight is not just ours," she said. "It is the fight of every tribe, every person who understands the importance of protecting what is theirs. It is a fight for the future, a fight for freedom." Thomas nodded, taking in her words. "But how do we keep fighting when it feels like the world is closing in on us?" he asked. Nehemina looked at him then, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You fight because it is who you are. You fight because the land we stand on is worth more than the life we have to give. And you fight because, together, we are strong." Her words seemed to settle in his chest, comforting him in a way that was hard to describe. He had always thought of strength as something physical, something you could measure by muscle and endurance. But Nehemina had taught him that true strength came from something deeper, something tied to the land, to the people you fought for, and to the honor of your tribe. The next few days were filled with preparations. The Apache were gathering their strength, forging alliances with neighboring tribes, and reinforcing their position in the desert. Thomas had learned to live with the knowledge that battles were inevitable. Every fight brought them one step closer to survival, but it also brought them closer to the risk of losing everything. One evening, as the camp settled into a hushed calm, Nehemina approached him again. This time, there was something different in her gaze. "You have proven yourself, Thomas McCall," she said. "You are one of us now. But the time has come for you to truly understand the cost of this fight." Thomas raised an eyebrow, curious but wary of what was to come. "What do you mean?" he asked. Nehemina stepped closer, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "This war is not just about defending the land. It is about something greater, the survival of our people, the preservation of our culture, and the legacy of those who came before us. You have chosen to stand with us. But now, you must understand that what we fight for is not just for today. It is for every generation that will follow." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket, suffocating but enlightening. This wasn't just a battle against invaders or the government. It was a fight for the very soul of the Apache people. Thomas had come to the tribe for many reasons, but now, he realized, he was part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just learning how to survive in the wilderness. He was learning how to preserve a way of life that had endured for centuries. As the days grew darker and the threat of war loomed even closer, Thomas felt an unshakable resolve take root inside him. The Apache had taught him the true meaning of strength, of honor, and of sacrifice. He was no longer just a man from the plains. He was a protector of the land and the people who called it home. The fight that lay ahead would be brutal, but Thomas was ready. He had chosen his side, and he would stand firm, no matter the cost. The winds had picked up as the Apache tribe prepared for the worst. Thomas McCall could feel the tension in the air, a palpable electricity that made every warrior's movements more deliberate. The scouts had brought word that a force of soldiers was marching toward them, and they were well armed. It was a battle that Thomas knew was coming, but the timing, the certainty of it, made his blood run cold. Nehemina had spent the last few days rallying her warriors, preparing them for the fight ahead. The air around the campfire was thick with strategy, the warriors talking in low voices, sharing information, and offering counsel. As the chief of the Apache, Nehemina held a position of strength, but Thomas could see the burden in her eyes. Every decision she made, every order she gave, weighed on her heavily. She was not just a leader. She was the protector of her people, and the responsibility was enormous. "We will fight them, Thomas," Nehemina said one night, her voice as steady as always, but with an undertone that betrayed the gravity of the situation. "But this will not be a fight like any other. They will come with all their might, and they will want to crush us. We have to show them that we will not fall." Thomas looked at her, understanding the seriousness of the battle ahead. This was not just about defeating an enemy. This was about proving to the world that the Apache would not be wiped out, that their way of life would continue despite the centuries of conflict. "We are with you," Thomas said, his voice firm, a newfound confidence rising within him. "We will fight, and we will win." Nehemina nodded, her eyes meeting his, a small glimmer of something like gratitude flashing across her face. But it was quickly replaced by the calm resolve that had become a hallmark of her leadership. "We fight not just for us," she said. "We fight for the generations that will come after us. For the children, for the land. For everything we hold sacred." The night before the battle, Thomas sat alone by the fire, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. He had once been a simple rancher, a man whose life was defined by his work with the land. Now, he was a warrior, standing beside a people he had come to respect and admire. The land he had once tended now felt like a part of him, and the Apache way of life, with its deep connection to the earth, had become his own. As the stars twinkled above, he thought of the life he had left behind, of the family he had once known. He had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the camp was quiet. The warriors, young and old, were preparing for the coming fight. Their horses were saddled, weapons were checked, and there was a sense of unity in the air that Thomas had never felt before. As they rode out to face the enemy, the Apache warriors moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Each person knew their role, and each person was committed to the fight. They rode not just for survival, but for the future. The battle was fierce and long, the air thick with the sound of gunfire and the cries of men and horses. The soldiers came at them in waves, but the Apache fought with the knowledge that they were defending everything that mattered. Thomas fought beside Nehemina, their swords clashing with the soldiers, the air filled with dust and the acrid smell of smoke. As the hours dragged on, Thomas's muscles ached, his breath ragged. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the Apache people needed him. Nehemina fought beside him, her presence a constant reminder of why they were here. She was a force of nature, and in her, Thomas saw the spirit of the Apache people, their resilience, their strength, their unwavering will to survive. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The soldiers, though powerful, were not prepared for the tenacity and strategy of the Apache. With each wave, the Apache warriors pushed them back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers began to retreat. The Apache had won. The field was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both Apache and soldier alike. Thomas stood in the midst of it, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his mind racing. They had done it. They had protected their people. Nehemina rode up beside him, her face covered in dust, but her eyes burning with victory. "We did it," she said, her voice low, but filled with pride. "We fought for what is ours, and we will continue to fight." Thomas nodded, the weight of the battle still heavy on his shoulders. But as he looked around at the warriors, at the land they had fought to protect, he knew that this victory, though hard won, was just the beginning. The fight for the Apache people was far from over, and he would be there, by their side, for as long as they needed him. The weeks that followed the battle were filled with an uneasy peace. Thomas McCall had grown accustomed to the routine of life with the Apache tribe, though it was never the same. Each day felt like it brought a new challenge, a new test of loyalty, strength, and resilience. The warriors who had once fought alongside him now regarded him with respect, and he was no longer just a man who had stumbled into their camp. He was part of the tribe, bound by more than just his decision to fight. The Apache had welcomed him into their fold, and with each passing day, he understood more about their way of life, their beliefs, and their unwavering connection to the land. Nehemina, who had become not only a leader but a mentor to Thomas, continued to guide him through the intricacies of Apache culture. She taught him the sacred rituals, the meaning behind every dance, every song, and the stories that defined their people. But even as he learned, Thomas felt a constant undercurrent of tension. The fight for the land was not over. It was a fight that had lasted for generations and would continue for many more. But for the first time, Thomas felt that he was truly part of something that was bigger than any one man. One evening, as the fire burned low, Nehemina called Thomas aside. She stood alone by the edge of the camp, looking out over the vast expanse of land that stretched before them. Her eyes were distant, her expression unreadable. As he approached, she turned to him, her face softening slightly. "We have fought, Thomas. We have won. But the enemy is relentless. They will never stop coming for us," she said, her voice low, but firm. "And we must be ready for the next battle." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The Apache had fought for centuries, and yet, despite their victories, the world outside their tribe was always looking for a way to tear them down. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked. "We prepare," Nehemina said simply. "We gather our strength, form alliances with other tribes, and continue to teach our children the ways of the Apache. We fight not just for today, but for the future, for the generations that will come after us." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "And we make sure that the world knows that the Apache are not a people who will simply fade away. We are a people who will survive." That night, as the moon rose high above the camp, Thomas found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn. Once a lonely rancher, now a warrior, a protector, and a member of the Apache tribe. He had come to this land seeking purpose, and now he had found it. The future was uncertain, and the challenges ahead would be great. But Thomas was ready. He was ready to fight for the land, for the people, and for the legacy of the Apache. The next day, the warriors gathered, their faces set with determination. Nehemina led them, her presence commanding, her spirit unyielding. They were preparing for the next phase of their struggle. A new enemy had emerged on the horizon, and this time, they would not be caught off guard. Thomas stood among them, his heart steady, his resolve firm. The Apache were ready to face whatever came next. As they rode out together, the wind blowing across the plains, Thomas felt a deep sense of unity. They were more than just a tribe. They were a family, bound together by a shared purpose and a shared history. The fight for their future had just begun, and Thomas was ready to stand with them, side by side, through whatever challenges lay ahead. This was his fight now. It was a fight he would never back down from. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The Apache warriors had been training, relentlessly, sharpening their skills and reinforcing their unity. The alliance with neighboring tribes had strengthened, and Thomas McCall had begun to feel more deeply the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He was no longer just a rancher who had stumbled into the world of the Apache. He was now a warrior, a protector, and part of a long-standing legacy of resistance. Nehemina had been instrumental in his transformation, guiding him not just in battle, but in the philosophy and spirit of the Apache people. She taught him the significance of every action, every word, and every choice. But as much as Thomas had learned, there was a part of him that still longed for the simplicity of his past life, his quiet ranch, the comfort of the familiar, and the peace that had once been his. Yet, the reality was that the world around him had changed. The land was no longer a place of solitude. It was a battlefield, and the Apache had to defend it. As the time for the next battle approached, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. The soldiers were coming, this time in greater numbers, and their objective was clear: to destroy the Apache once and for all. The stakes had never been higher. Nehemina's eyes were focused as she addressed the tribe. "We have fought for centuries," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the past. "And we will continue to fight for what is ours. For our land, our families, our way of life. This is the moment we stand together." The warriors, their faces set with determination, nodded in unison. The women of the tribe gathered with them, and the children stood in the background, watching. The energy in the camp was palpable, a quiet intensity that spoke volumes about the resolve of the Apache people. Thomas stood beside Nehemina, his heart racing. He had been through battles before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about defending themselves. It was about preserving everything they had fought for. The soldiers were closing in, and the Apache were ready. They had learned from their past, they had built alliances, and they had strengthened their bonds. This time, they would not be caught off guard. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the valley, The sound of hooves echoed. Familiar rush of adrenaline flooded his body. The battle would be fierce, but it was one they could not afford to lose. The Apache moved quickly, silently, as they had done so many times before. They knew the land, they knew the enemy, and they were ready. Nehemina led them, her posture tall and proud, her presence commanding. The warriors followed her with unwavering loyalty, and Thomas rode with them, his sword at the ready. The soldiers were waiting for them, positioned at the edge of the valley. They had set up camp, thinking they had the upper hand, but the Apache had already moved into position. The battle that followed was chaotic, intense, and brutal. The sound of clashing weapons, the roar of horses, and the cries of men filled the air. Thomas fought with a precision he had learned from the Apache, each strike purposeful, each movement calculated. He could see Nehemina moving through the battlefield, her strength and skill evident as she took down her enemies with ease. As the battle raged on, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride. He was not just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the future of the Apache people. He was part of something far greater than himself. After hours of fierce combat, the Apache warriors emerged victorious once again. The soldiers, though numerous, had been no match for the agility, the tactics, and the unwavering resolve of the Apache. As the dust settled, Thomas stood in the midst of the battlefield, his body bruised and tired, but his spirit strong. The Apache had once again defended their land, and they had shown the world that they would not be defeated. Nehemina rode up beside him, her face grim but proud. "We have won, but the war is not over," she said. "There will always be those who seek to take what is ours. But we will continue to fight. We will continue to stand." Thomas looked at her, his heart full of respect. "And we will fight together," he said, his voice steady. Nehemina nodded, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. They had fought side by side, and they would continue to do so. The Apache people had endured, and they would endure again. As the warriors rode back to the camp, the sun rising behind them, Thomas felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was long, and there would be more battles to come, but he knew one thing for certain. He had found his place. He had found his family, and together, they would fight for their future, for their land, and for everything they held dear.